Thursday evening UK time, so that's Thursday at 6 o'clock, and we're just debating whether to call it tea garden conversation or tea garden chat.
Thursday garden.
Oh, Thursday, yeah, Thursday garden chat, Thursday garden conversation. We need Thursday in the title, otherwise people will forget which day of the week it is. So those are the free talks, but we've got lots and lots of webinars lined up. I hope all of you watching tuned in yesterday for Katie Merrington at the Hepworth Wakefield. That was an absolute joy. If you didn't manage to catch yesterday, it is up on YouTube now, and it is just absolutely wonderful. She was terrific. Just to say a few of the webinars coming up. On Monday, we have the Mean Rouse webinar, which is really unmissable. You really, if you're a designer or a plants person, I would say that you have to do this one. We have another webinar with Liz Ackerley next week, which is sold out, but we've got an extra day on the 15th of June with Liz, which still has places. And we have Tom DeWitter, again, 2 days in 1 week. The extra day is the 11th, and we have some places on that. We have Troy Scott-Smith talking about old-fashioned roses on the 12th, and Nick Bailey on the 16th talking about colour. So some amazing webinars coming up, and more planned. So
more
we will
in
keep
the pipeline.
Yeah, more in the pipeline. Some really exciting ones. And so yes, as I was saying, this is the last time we're going to be doing a 4 o'clock every day. Noel and I both have lots of work that's backing up. I've got clients who are getting quite anxious. So yeah, we are going to be doing it once a week. But what we'd like to do, we'd just like to set a little mini competition here, because we've had lots and lots of amazing emails from people, really lovely emails, lots of them, and messages saying thank you very much and what our tea time talks have meant to them. So what we'd like to ask you to do, all of you that are into social media, is just put a little tiny snippet, movie snippet on Instagram, just a couple of sentences saying what the tea time talks have meant for you during lockdown. Just literally a couple of sentences, and obviously don't forget to tag Garden Masterclass. That's the whole point. And then the ones that I think we'll choose a couple of our favourites, and they will win a very exciting prize, of which I could give a little clue to, but I can't give the whole game away. It'll be a free entry to a webinar with probably the most well-known garden designer in the world, really. So yeah, so and the deadline is, if you could do that by June the 5th, so just put something up on Instagram. If Instagram's not your thing and Facebook or Twitter is your thing, then that's fine, but just it would be nice if it was a little piece to camera, just to your phone, and just to say, you know, what this has meant to you. So that would be wonderful. So June the 5th is the deadline. I will post something up on Instagram about that. We'd like to say thank you to everybody who's donated so far. Noel and I have been doing this now for, what, 2 months plus?
Is it as long as that?
Yeah, it is. It has to be.
40, nearly 40 events. In fact, I think it probably is 40 events, actually. 40
events. Okay, so there's 40 movies on YouTube to be watched. Yes, so those of you who have donated, thank you very much indeed. If you haven't donated and you're in a position to donate, we really appreciate that, because we do have lots of things planned. We're quite ambitious, the pair of us, and Noel comes up with mad ideas and I say, no, you can't do that, and then we do it. so watch this space is all I'm saying. If you're not on our mailing list, then gardenmasterclass@gmail.com, send us an email. We will send out newsletters probably once we get into the rhythm of the Thursday night talks. Then we'll send out more regularly the newsletters so that you don't miss out on webinars. If anybody is booked onto an event that should be happening in June or July, and we are postponing dates, if you haven't heard from me, you should have heard from me. So I've sent out emails. I'm up to about the middle of July at the moment, and we're postponing where we can. But a couple of people have fallen through the net. So if you haven't heard and you have got tickets for an event and you're wondering what's happening, well, June and July, yeah, shout. We need to hear from you. So I think that's all the housekeeping, isn't it, Noel, for the time being?
I think it is, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Time to introduce our speaker.
Yeah,
and we're going up to Scotland today for our last tea garden talk. Been feeling slightly guilty, actually. We've not been to Scotland so far. I've always made a great point over the last 10, 15 years of writing about Scottish gardens. There's a very interesting garden tradition up there, and in many ways gardens with places with very attractive gardening climates. And I've also, just before really all this lockdown kicked off, I was just on the point of starting far and away the biggest planting design project of my life in Edinburgh. Of course, that's all on hold. And we're just hoping that we can start off from where we left off with that. I want to introduce Ken Cox, who is from one of those dynasties of growers, of nursery people, Glendoick Gardens, who produce a truly incredible range of rhododendrons. Ken, we're going to talk to Ken about the nursery business, about rhododendrons in the wild, and we're going to end up then looking a little bit at Scottish gardens. So, Ken, over to you and your remarkable family history.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me on this. Great privilege to do it. Let's see if I can get the technology to work.
Ken.
Right, so here we go. So this is Glendoick. This is a 1747 mansion between Dundee on the east coast of Scotland. What happened in 1745 was that basically all the landowners in Scotland decided which side to back, depending on whether they were Catholic and tended towards Bonnie Prince Charlie, or they decided the English were going to win this particular battle. Those who decided to side with Bonnie Prince Charlie had their lands confiscated for a while, often. They sometimes just gave them to cousins and things like that. And those who supported the English got rewarded with money and jobs and land. And this is a perfect example of that. 1747, Robert Craigie was made Lord Advocate of Scotland, and he built this house. And it stayed in his family for about 100 years, and my family bought it in 1898. My family were Dutch immigrants into Dundee who came to do and started the jute business. And I don't know how many well-known the story of jute in Dundee is. I'm going to write a book about this in my retirement. This was the Microsoft or the Google of its time. It was the biggest industry in the world with the biggest factories. They made more money than anyone had ever made before. They invented unit trusts. They financed railroads in America. It was an absolute boom. This was my family's factory, which was the largest factory in the world at the time, about 1880. So that was basically how we came to, and the Cox brothers all bought mansions all the way around Dundee. In the 1930s, it all went bust. They missed out on the oil boom, and they were still trying to make jute. But what actually happened was the second sons, who didn't inherit the jute companies, went to India and did the jute in India, and it wasn't worth exporting it anymore. So my great-grandfather, here he is on the left, he planted the first rhododendrons in about 1900. You can actually see them in this picture. These are now absolutely gigantic. But he had no particular interest in gardening. He was a jute baron, really. And his son, Ewan, who's on the right here, was his only son, and he was definitely destined to go into the jute business. And my grandfather couldn't have wanted to do anything less than go into the jute business. And he was working in the First World War in the propaganda office, where Reginald Farrah, at that time, probably best known plant hunter and garden writer of the Edwardian era. And he met Farrah, and Farrah said, "Would you like to come to Burma plant hunting with me?" And my grandfather thought this was the best excuse to not going back to Dundee to run the jute business. So I always imagine this telegram that might have gone back to Dundee saying, "Regret, can't come to work in Dundee, have gone to Burma." So the two of them went to Burma in the summer of 1919, and Farrah was a very, very difficult man to get on with. He only ever went plant hunting once with each of his companions because they basically couldn't stand the sight of him by the end of it. Nicholas Schulman wrote a brilliant book called A Rage for Rock Gardening. It's all in there if you want to know about it. And in the autumn, my grandfather said, I've had enough of this, I'm going home. And Farrah said he was going to stay out for another year. So my grandfather brought all the seeds back to distribute to the sponsors of the expedition. So that included people like J.C. Williams at K. Hayes and Leonard's Lee Gardens, Exbury, these kind of places. And Farrah died in the following year out in Burma in 1920. And so my grandfather was the last person from the West to see this great plant hunter alive. So he wrote a book called Farrah's Last Journey about their trip. And that was really his way into horticulture. And I mean, it's all these things are very fortuitous. If my grandfather hadn't bumped into Farrah at a tea party in 1918 or whenever it was, we wouldn't be doing what we're doing now, I'm sure. So my grandfather became a full-time garden writer. He was the garden editor of Country Life. He restarted William Robinson's magazine, Flora and Silver, and called it New Flora and Silver. So he ran that through the 1920s and the 1930s. And he started the nursery with my dad, Peter Cox, who's on the left in this picture, in the 1950s. And so I guess my choice was, I suppose, to either reject the whole exercise or come on board and join the family thing. And I think what swayed it for me probably was I went to America when I was 17, and I managed to get a work permit to work in rhododendron nurseries because they were obviously quite keen to employ me. I knew nothing about rhododendrons. The problem was that they all expected me to be an expert when I went over there. So I thought I'd better read some books, and I kept finding shelves and shelves of books written by my grandfather and father, so I thought I'd better start with them. And by the time I came back, I was quite knowledgeable. My father was quite surprised, actually, that I came back with some knowledge. And my father was very friendly with Geordie Sheriff from the Ludlow and Sheriff plant hunting in Tibet, particularly. And he lived quite near us in Scotland. And Geordie Sheriff basically sold the dream of plant hunting to my father, which is but the problem was that in the 1940s and 50s, you couldn't go plant hunting. All the countries were closed. And my father and Peter Hutchison, they formed this sort of plant hunting partnership in the 1960s, but they had a very limited number of places they could go, but they did manage to get into Arunachal Pradesh, northeast India in 1965. They left me aged 1 with my godmother, and my mum and my father and Peter Hutchison went off. And they had a terrible time. They spent most of the time in Indian government officials' offices trying to get permits for places they'd been promised. But they still managed to find all sorts of new things, including 3 new species of rhododendron, which wasn't bad considering they couldn't get to most of the places they were expecting to get to. So here they are here. Santa Pauai on the left, Coxianum, named after my family, in the middle, and Southern Syriense on the right. Now, I wouldn't say any of these are world-beating garden plants, but hey-ho, they're new rhododendron species. It's always very exciting when you discover new rhododendron species, so that was the beginning of that. And then my parents were also pioneering garden centre operators. They were very friendly with people like John Ravenscroft at Bridgemere, and so we started one of the first garden centres in Scotland, and this is the first. This is it when it opened in 1973, with the first extension of many that we've had since. Yeah, it was just a shed really with some plants out the back. This is what the plants area looks like now. I'm more familiar with most garden centres. No, I don't know. If you need to speak to me, I can't actually.
I was just very amused by that sign in the previous photograph saying internationally approved.
Yes.
So you had to have some sort of
this is a thing called the International Garden Centre Group. It still exists. It's called the Garden Centre Association, but there is an international version. Yes. It's basically they have an annual tour drinking session. Yeah.
Right.
It's been cancelled this year. It was meant to be in South Africa. So in 1981, really important thing happened. This was the SBEC expedition to Yunnan, Roy Lancaster and my father and various other people were on it. And this was the first big scale expedition to the China Hevelair area since the sort of closure of that area in 1981. And the SBEC expedition, here they are here. It was absolutely fascinating. The culture clash, really. Two cultures had been so isolated for each other for such a long time. So one of the first, Guan Kaiyong, who's the gentleman on the top right, he later became the director of the Kunming Institute, but he was then a translator. And they'd never taken any Westerners on an expedition before, and they didn't really know what they would put up with or what they wanted or anything. So one of the first questions he asked my father and Roy Lancaster was, do Westerners eat rice? Which is quite interesting because they weren't sure what they were going to feed them on. Anyway, they did eat rice, and actually it was a very successful expedition, and they camped, they went all over this mountain that George Forrest had explored. And what was remarkable about it was, although this was a mountain that was very well botanized in previous years, there were all sorts of plants there that either hadn't been found or hadn't been introduced before. And it made people realize that even in the areas of China that had been quite well botanized by Frank Kingdon Ward or George Forrest, that there were lots of goodies there still that hadn't been introduced before. And in fact, even after this lot had been up there a couple of times, I went up to the top of that mountain and I found a rhododendron species that hadn't been introduced before, which they hadn't spotted. So it's kind of interesting how many times you go to the same place, and if you just use your eyes and just happen to be there at a different month or a different week, that you find different things. And in those days, you had to walk from the bottom of the hill and camp on the way up, and it might take you 3 days to reach the top of the hill here. Now there are cable cars up these mountains in China. So a lot of people say to me, oh, I'm too old for plant hunting these days. Actually, in China now, you can go plant hunting in cable cars and walk down, not have to walk up at all. And it's not something I'm particularly attracted to, because to me, the thing about plant hunting is getting out into the wilds and being stuck out there for several days. So if you can run up in a cable car, not quite the same thing. And there's millions of Chinese tourists doing the same thing, and you don't feel quite so intrepid as you used to. And I mentioned that this extraordinary thing that every time anyone's gone to China in the last 100 years, they've said, oh, we think we've got all the good things. Beaches in 1899 told Ernest Wilson not to bother wasting his time, just go for the hit list of things that they wanted, like the handkerchief tree, and not to waste too much time because all the good things would have been found. That's probably the stupidest remark ever made in horticultural history, given the tens of thousands of plants that were discovered after that in all over China and are still being discovered. And it is the most amazing treasure trove of stuff. There are more plants on Mount Omei, species of plants on Mount Omei or the Kangshan in Yunnan than in the whole flora of Europe. 10,000 species of plants on one mountain range. I mean, it's incredibly rich, from tropical at the bottom to alpine at the top. So this is a rhododendron that was introduced by my father in the mid-1980s called Ochrasium. Brilliant garden plant, flowers young, compact, really good foliage, suitable for any garden. It's a prime example. It was actually discovered about 100 years ago, but never introduced. Here's another one called Platypodum. And this is an interesting one because it seems incredibly rare in the wild. It's on the red list as being threatened. So there are conservation issues here about trying to get some of these plants distributed before they may, for climate reasons or farming or any other reason. China is changing so fast that if you go, you might go to the same place 5 years later, and what was once a field has turned into a city in 5 years. It's just with 8-lane highways running through it. So some of the plants in China are unbelievably threatened, especially the low altitude ones. It's not so bad up in the mountains. They're pretty well protected. And climate change is the other big issue in China, that we go to places that plant hunters were there 100 years ago, and they talk about glacial moraines and the outflows of the water and all these primulas and Mecanopsis, and we go to those glacial moraines and they've dried up. The glacier has retreated hundreds of feet up the mountains and they're not there anymore. Tony Kirkham did something similar in in Sichuan, he went and photographed all the same photographs that Wilson, from the same places that Wilson did. And again, these glaciers was one of the things that we were looking at just to compare. In 100 years, if those glaciers can retreat that far, you know, it's quite shocking. And that might mean the extinction of plants as a result of them not being there. This is another brilliant rhododendron introduction, maybe 15 years ago, called Ye Fengensi, named by some Chinese botanists. Very compact, in flower right now, or just coming into flower. Flowers really young, brilliant garden plant for small gardens. Yeah, so I think the early plant hunters from the golden age would be quite surprised how many things they missed first time round like this. So this is Peter Hutchison and my father. Peter Hutchison died about a year ago. And my father's still going. He's in his late 80s now. He's quite frail, but he gets out in the garden. And he was weeding the other day, and he fell over. He'd forgotten his mobile phone, and we couldn't find him. And I found him face down in a flower bed. He'd fallen over, and he couldn't get up. Luckily, he'd only been there for a short time. I managed to get him back. But he's still determined to get out in the garden, and he's still on me. If I haven't done any weeding, or I haven't done this, or I haven't done that, then he tells me about it. So Peter Hutchison and my father went to China and the Himalayas around 20-something times, and eventually they wrote this book called Seeds of Adventure. It's 2.2 kilograms. I always to say to people, if you read it in bed and you fall asleep, you'll probably die under the weight of it. And the reason it's so enormous is my father refused to edit it. My wife was a literary agent and an editor, offered to edit it. So she edited a small part and said, you know, and he said, no, I don't want to cut anything. That's what I did. So it's a very large book. But if you want to know about plant hunting in China, it's definitely one of the, you know, it's amazing sort of treasure trove of information from a wide area. And one of the things that my grandfather's legacy, I suppose, is to breed his children and grandson who are into writing gardening books. I think there's about 35 of them altogether from the lot of us. Quite a lot of co-writes. And yeah, so it's an amazing sort of, when you look at the Cox shelf now at Glendoick, of how many books we've managed to write. The golden age of garden writing seems to be over, I think. There's not so many books written these days. Noel, you seem to still find things.
We can't try, some of us keep trying to keep the flame alive.
Yes, no, we do too. Yeah, yeah, I know. So my dad got an MBE eventually. That was quite entertaining. A few years ago, went to Buckingham Palace with Nicholas Sirota and various others. And there they are. It was one of the, yeah. Now, I was really fascinated with Frank Kingdon Ward and his work in Tibet. And this is really about being in the right place at the right time. Lots of people like Tony Schilling from Wakehurst Place and Kew had tried to get into Southeast Tibet in the 80s, and they tend to get permission, and then when they got there they were told, no, you can't do it, it's too sensitive. That border area between India and China is disputed. There's lots of incursions all the time from the Chinese army. They invaded in 1965 into Arunachal and had to be persuaded by Americans to get out at the time, otherwise it was going to create another Cuban missile thing. So Frank Kingdon Ward, he went to the Tsangpo Gorges area in 1924. And he wrote this classic book, Riddle of the Tsangpo Gorges. And it was my sort of plant hunting Bible. So that was the area that I wanted to go to. And I also realized there were lots of areas in that region that hadn't been explored before. And luckily in 1995, when we got permission to go in here, we managed to get in. One of the things we realized is the Chinese military didn't really understand the names of the places we were applying to. So they said we could go to places, but they didn't really know where we were going. And so occasionally that got us into trouble. But generally, we got this really small window, 5 years, where we managed to get into this area and explore. Now, this terrain is unbelievably difficult to get around. As you can see from this shot here, very, very deep valleys, gorges with the Tsangpo River running through it. And when you're there in the spring, you can hear avalanches crashing away above you in the mist. You've no idea whether any of the avalanches are heading your way or not. You just have to go with it. And this shot here shows the Doshong La, which is Kingdon Ward's fabled pass, which he called the Rhododendron Fairyland. We wanted to go there. We went there at the end of May, thinking that was a good time of year to aim for. Usually that's good for high altitude plants. And the Tsangpo River runs between these two peaks, Jalaperi and Namche. They're 25,000 feet high, more or less, and then the gorge runs at about 10,000 feet. So it's a 15,000 foot deep gorge. It's arguably the deepest in the world. Some people say there's another one somewhere else. I can't remember where else, but anyway. And yeah, if you go in one end, it'll take you several weeks to hack your way through to get to the other end. And the problem with the Doshong La at the end of May in 1995 was that there was no way this pass was open. It was all still covered in snow, but we found some intrepid porters who said, well, you know, if you're game for it, you can have a go. So we went over the pass and we walked and we walked and we walked. And they said, no, there is somewhere I think we can camp at the bottom. It's a very long day, this was, I tell you. And we slipped and slid all our way over here, and we spent a few days over the Doshong La. And it is rhododendron fairyland. We camped in exactly the same camping site that Kingdom Ward was in. He described a rock where the porters sheltered underneath. It was still there and so on. It's great. Now, I mentioned that sometimes we got into trouble. The problem was that the Chinese police and the PSB, as they're called, just didn't believe that anyone would go to the mountains of Tibet to look for plants. They were quite sure we must be spying. And so we used to get arrested quite regularly. And they used to do things like take our films off us and so on. Yeah, it was quite bizarre, really. They even, somebody had drawn watercolors in their diary, and they were very unhappy about that because it showed the mountains in the background. They thought this might be spying. So we had to paint the mountains out of these watercolors so that we were allowed to be released and so on. It was extraordinary times. And somehow the press got hold of this. And so we had lots and lots of press coverage because we were all delayed because we were arrested. And to this day, I have no idea how it was that the press got hold of some of these stories. But anyway, I got called the Scottish Indiana Jones, as you can see there. And the Sun once arrived with an Indiana Jones hat for me to wear so they could take photographs of me and stuff. It was really weird. Anyway, no harm done. We got out. And then after 2000, I met an American explorer called Ken Storm in about 1998. And we really wanted to explore the Indian side of the Tsangpo Gorges region, this sacred region. And we realized no one had really done any botanizing there at all. And we managed to get permission from the Indian government to go up there. We were the first people to do this. And in order to get to this area, this bridge was the first thing we had to go over. Now, we've been over suspension bridges before, but they were usually, 100 meters or whatever. This one's about half a mile long. And most of the planks had fallen out. And so you were sort of looking down into this raging torrent underneath. And what they do is they steal the planks from the edge of the bridge and they move them to the middle. So as the bridge deteriorates, it gets worse and worse, and you're sort of sitting on wires. And I've been over this bridge about 6 times now. And yeah, I tell you, it is quite a terrifying experience. If you meet somebody coming the other way, you have to lean over to the railings while they've got their packs on their backs and whatever. It's even more terrifying. But anyway, it's part of plant hunting. And it is my favorite swing suspension bridge in the Himalayan region. I'm sure there's an even more spectacular one somewhere. And this valley, right on the Tibet-India border, revealed lots of new plants, including a forest of a completely new giant rhododendron species, which I named Titapuriense after the pilgrimage route that we were on when we discovered it. It is a very beautiful thing. It's proving to be really hard to cultivate, sadly. I keep getting emails from people saying, I've got Titapuriense, it looks miserable, what do you do? The answer is, I haven't cracked it yet. We've still got it going quite well, but it's just not that amenable. But somebody will crack it. Here's the describing of it in the Plantsman. Yeah, so that was pretty exciting. And apart from introducing plants from the wild, the other thing that Glendoick is well known for is all the hybridizing that we've done. Rhododendron hybridizing until the 1950s was mainly done by the big gardens like Exbury and Cahay's that had hundreds of acres and many gardeners to look after them. But what my father realized in the 1950s and 60s was that people wanted rhododendrons and azaleas for small gardens. And so he looked around at dwarf rhododendron species like this one, Rhododendron ludlowii, and thought it would make a good parent. I don't know why he did, because this plant is almost impossible to keep alive, but it turned out to be quite a good parent. And I think what attracted him was the relative scale, the ratio between the leaf size and the flower size. The leaf is tiny, as you can see, and the flower is relatively large. So he used this as a parent. This is one of his first successes, which is a rhododendron curlew. My dad was, as well as being into plants, was into birds. So he decided to name all his rhododendron hybrids after birds. And I think there's 34 of them now. So here are a few. Ptarmigan, snow grouse, white. Razorbill. This one's got very odd tubular flowers, which is from a rhododendron called Spinuliferum. Not a typical looking rhododendron, I think you would admit. So here are some of the birds. Yeah, I can't see which ones I can see there. Teal, egret, quail, tinkerbird, and so on. And what we're always doing with hybridizing is people say, have you got a small scented rhododendron? Because most of them are pretty big and straggly. So we think, no, that's a good thing. Let's try and produce a small scented rhododendron that's hardy enough for the UK. How do we do that? We'll find some parents, we'll make the hybrid. And this is Tinkerbird. Tinkerbird is now produced in huge quantities by the big wholesale nurseries in England, and you can buy it in any garden centre. So it's a small, compact, very sweetly scented rhododendron that you can grow pretty much anywhere in the UK, as long as you're not halfway up a mountain in the middle of Scotland. And it was absolutely stunning this year, and you can smell it from quite some distance. Now, another problem, which we're probably going to discuss in a little bit more detail later, is how the climate of Scotland is different from further south in England. And with evergreen azaleas, most of them come from Japan, which has a very continental climate, very cold in winter, very hot in summer. And Scotland definitely doesn't have that. It has more or less the same climate all year round, kind of cool and damp and cloudy. That's the typical default position for Scotland. It never gets much above 80 degrees Fahrenheit, 30 degrees centigrade. That's about the limit. And it means that some plants from countries like Japan don't ripen their wood properly. And so when the first frosts in the winter come, the plants are still rather green. The summer heat hasn't taken effect. So most Japanese azaleas are pretty useless in Scotland, and they take 2 steps forward and 1 step back each year, and you get a lot of dieback in the wood and so on. Not very satisfactory. So my father decided to try and breed rhododendrons and azaleas, evergreen azaleas that were suitable for Scotland. And in order to do that, he used a Taiwanese species called Nakaharai, which comes from a sort of wet climate, more Scottish type climate. And he crossed that with the Japanese ones and ended up breeding lots of wonderful azaleas, which are now very good sellers all over Europe and in North America. So he'd run out of birds' names, so he went for mammals this time. So these were called squirrel, wombat, panda, lemur, chipmunk, chinchilla, beaver, opossum, raccoon, and so on and so on. And one of the nice things about having these series like this is that once people start collecting them, they like them and they want to collect more of them. So we name them and so on. And it's quite a nice thing. And you can find some of these plants in most garden centres this time of year. And then I started breeding double evergreen azaleas that were suitable for Scotland. Not everybody likes double flowers, but you just get the most amazing effects on these evergreen azaleas. That's Glendoick Glacier. This is Glendoick Ruffles, which has got a sort of funny looking beard in the middle of it. There's nothing else on the market like that. And this is another thing that we quite like. I find this Japanese azalea called Koromo Shikabu, and very beautiful. It does really well in Normandy and Brittany and France, but it doesn't do very well in Scotland. Usual thing with Japanese azaleas, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So I started breeding with that, and I produced this one on the right, which is called Glendoick Starburst, which is a good doer in Scotland. It has this funny sort of very narrow petal. One of the criticisms that I often hear about rhododendrons is, oh, they're all very well, but they only flower in the spring. Now, many rhododendrons have very beautiful foliage, but we reckon there was quite a lot of potential work to do in breeding coloured foliage rhododendrons that would look good all the year round. And here are some examples of the different colours of rhododendron leaves. Silvery ones are relatively easy to produce. Quite a lot of these rhododendrons have ingumentum, a covering of hairs on the new growth. It tends to be on high altitude plants, and it seems to protect the new growth from UV radiation. You find them in Taiwan and in Japan on the mountaintops, on the species there. This is actually a hybrid between the best Japanese species, Yakushimanum, with silver leaves, and the best Taiwanese species, Pachysanthem, and this is called Viking Silver, because the cross was made in Denmark, and they sent us lots of seedlings, and we selected one. And as this here, you can see growing with an anthermis. It's a really nice combination of the silver foliage. And you know, from a garden design point of view, this silver foliage works as a brilliant foil. Lots of people use it a lot in bedding and in perennial schemes to show off other plants, and it works very well in gardens too. But what we really wanted to do was to look at all these shrubs like Cotinus with red leaves, like Photinias with red new growth, all that sort of thing, and think, can we make rhododendrons that do that kind of thing? So you'll get the flowers in the spring, and then you'll get red colouring. This one, Wine and Roses, we found a rhododendron that had, a lot of rhododendrons have red undersides when they're juvenile, when they're very young seedlings, and very occasionally they keep that into adulthood. And so we thought, well, this is an interesting idea. If we could find a rhododendron with a red underside and it had a tendency to keep the leaves at an upright angle, then you could see the red leaf underside and they would sort of wave in the wind. And that's exactly what's happened with Wine and Roses. This is a huge seller now, sells thousands and thousands every year. It's in production in Belgium and Holland, and we get nice royalty checks for this every year, which is great. They've not been so successful with Everred. It's really good for us. It's really good in the west coast of America. And it's the first all year round stunning red foliage rhododendron. And this is really as good as any of those Cotinus type royal purple, that kind of thing. Great landscape shrub. But the further south you go, the more it's inclined to revert a little bit to green. But it does stay like this pretty much all the year round. In Scotland, it's a brilliant plant. It does have red flowers. We'd love it to have white flowers. But the flowers are in a way a bit irrelevant because the new growth is so spectacular that it's really grown for its new growth. And when we launched this, Peter Seabrook saw it and thought it was the best thing he'd ever seen and said, can I launch it in the sun? And I wasn't sure whether Everred and Wine and Roses would be the sort of thing that sun readers would go for, but he assured me that it wasn't. And I think we sold 1,000 pairs in about 5 minutes. So thank you very much to Peter Seabrook, one of the great horticultural ambassadors of Britain. The other thing about Everred and Wine and Roses was they're brilliant plants for Britain, but the big rhododendron industry in Europe is in Germany, in the Ammerland. They produce more rhododendrons there than the rest of the world put together. The scale is just unbelievable. And I do a lot of work over there. But they said, these plants of yours, they're fantastic, but we kill them. Every time there's a hard winter, they all get killed. In fact, the trials for the plant breeders' rights are in Bremen. We sent all the plants over. They had a hard winter in 2010-11. Sure you remember that? And they were all wiped out. So they said, can you produce us a red foliage rhododendron that we can grow in Germany? Well, this is it. It's called Wonder Red. And it's just being launched at the moment. It has amazing red flowers, as you can see, but the real attraction is this extraordinary red young growth. And it also has a red underside. So you've kind of got 3 great red things happening with this plant. So I'm very, we'd have taken this, we were going to do a foliage garden at Hampton Court this year with Plant Heritage, but obviously that's been put off to September. And I've decided that it's too complicated to do it in September this year. I'm not convinced. I'm not sure if Hampton Court will happen or not. I'm not sure the RHS know yet. But anyway, that's what we've been working on. So Glendoick is one of the Scottish woodland gardens. I think, Noel, you would say woodland gardening is one of the things we're quite good at in Scotland.
Yes, woodland gardening is something that throughout the British Isles, it's something that really from, I suppose, late 19th, early 20th century, I think we have been very good at. And of course, the great thing about Scotland is you've got this climate that's actually a very good growing climate, a sort of continuum through from spring, summer to autumn, and good light conditions, May, June and July, which to some extent compensate, I think, for lower temperatures. And there are certainly some particularly fantastic woodland gardens, and it's interesting that you've I really focused on this theme.
Yes, I mean, I think one of the things that Scotland's woodland gardens really excel at is the borrowed landscape.
Mm.
The best woodland gardens have really interesting terrain. And you really want gorges, you want valleys, you want streams, you want waterfalls, you want lakes and sea lochs and mountains and all that stuff. So Cornwall has pretty spectacular valleys, but they're not as. But you don't have the backdrops quite that the Scottish woodland gardens do. And I think that's what, in some ways, what makes them so good. The woodland gardens in the southeast of England now are really struggling with the lack of rainfall and the summer heat and so on. Although some of them, like the Valley Gardens and the Savile Gardens at Windsor, are still doing in pretty good order. Leonards Lee is still pretty good. That's reopened recently. Exbury, very low rainfall, so they're just putting on water all the time to keep them going. And I think increasingly in the south of east of England, it's probably going to become something of I'm not sure if it's going to be acceptable to pour that amount of water onto plants anymore. Cornwall, the rainfall, Wales, the rainfall is pretty good. Really, the west side of Britain is probably where these woodland gardens are going to carry on being gardened. Bodmin, for example, in North Wales has pretty high rainfall. That's probably the greatest woodland garden of all, I think. I wrote this book a few years ago on the history of woodland gardening and practice of woodland gardening because it was interesting. I went to see Brett Elliott when I had the idea to do this book at the Lindley Library and asked him what literature he knew of, and he said he had actually done a survey of it once, and he said there really wasn't any. No one had taken this. When you think about the amount of books on gardening with perennials,
Yes,
that there are, and you think this is a style of gardening that's taken off all over the world. You find them all over the place. Why has this style of gardening not been taken seriously, by garden designers and writers and so on? I talked to Christopher Bradley Hull about this, and he said the reason garden designers don't like woodland gardens is because their clients are so impatient. They want a garden tomorrow. And when you tell them you have to wait 10 or 20 years to mature, they're just not interested. And I think there's something in that.
A lot of truth in that, I think, yes.
Russell Page, actually, who's one of the great garden design writers of all time, he did a lot of woodland gardens in his time and was very, very keen to look at the design aspect of them. I think there is another thing that I think garden designers tend to think that there isn't any design in woodland gardens. And I think one of the reasons for that is because they're now 100 years old and they're pretty overgrown. And if there was any design, it's maybe disappeared. You can't really see what it was anymore. So this book was my attempt, if you like, to sort of redress that a little bit, to talk a lot about design and what Gertrude Jekyll and William Robinson said 100 years ago. And a lot of the things they said, people just ignored subsequently, like colour coordination. Woodland gardens don't tend to have much colour coordination. And woodland gardeners seem to be colourblind, largely. They're usually men, which has possibly got something to do with it. I think women have a much better sense of colour than men. And when I'm designing gardens for clients, it's the women who are always keen on actually trying to do the colour design stuff. And the men are more stamp collectors. They just want to have a really big collection of things. I don't know if that's the same, with other styles of garden design.
I think there's a whole possible event here, Annie. Tim and I did that at the Garden Museum once, didn't we? Women and men gardening. And
I think Ken's right, actually. Yeah. I mean, Rick Dark wrote a good book about woodland gardening, and Keith Wiley did a book on shade gardening. But I think woodland gardening is, I think it is quite popular. But I wonder, Ken, what do you think about colour later in the year in a woodland garden? Or are you really relying on textures and shades and rather of green rather than colour, sort of, summer through to autumn?
So I do concentrate quite a lot about this. There is a tendency for people who are woodland gardening to go magnolia, camellia, rhododendron-tastic and not have much room for the other stuff. And I think that's a choice they've made, but it doesn't have to be like that.
Sorry.
So I think there are 5 great woodland garden shrub and tree genera to play with, which are the 3 I mentioned. And then you've got hydrangeas, and then you've got maples. And so if you plant in fairly equal numbers, then you've got this continuum, if you like, of colour. So as soon as the rhododendrons go over, the hydrangeas start taking off and so on, and then you've got the maples in the autumn. Then I think you can do the woodland garden as a 9-month project. The other thing that I've experimented with a lot is clematis, late summer clematis. Rhododendrons and magnolias and camellias are brilliant things to grow Viticella clematis up. And as long as you tear them off every few years so they don't completely smother the plants. Yeah. Brilliant. So there's nothing to stop you having a woodland garden which becomes, an absolute forest of clematis.
That's a great idea. That's a really.
The other thing that I noticed was quite interesting is that you can do an amazing white garden in a woodland in the summer. And these patches of white, you don't need an awful lot of it to make an impact because it's so green. There are many late flowering rhododendrons that are white, but there's all sorts of other stuff too. Dogwoods and hoherias and all those kind of things, eucryphias, all that stuff.
Yeah, and Philadelphus as well will do okay, won't it?
Say that again?
Philadelphus in the woodland.
Yes, Philadelphus are fine. I mean, they don't so much do it for me because they're a bit lacking in architecture. So they're 11-month tedium and 1 month of and I tend to like plants that have a bit more form than a Philadelphus. There's nothing against Deutzes and Philadelphus. Yeah. They do a useful job.
And Ken, does this book also cover the underplanting in the woodland?
Absolutely.
Or is it... Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, brilliant, fabulous.
It covers the 3 layers. So yeah, there's so we start with the tree layer and the shrub layer, which is the things we're talking about, and then there's the perennial wildflower layer and how you manage that in a woodland. Yeah, absolutely. And we also deal with quite a lot of small-scale woodland gardens in half an acre, quarter of an acre. Scandinavian woodland gardening is done on a much smaller scale, so it doesn't have to be big estates.
Fantastic.
There's all that stuff.
Great. We have a few questions. Are you ready for questions?
Absolutely, yeah.
Great, okay. Well, pH, of course. Do all rhodos need acid? And we're all led to believe that. How true is it?
Yes, it's interesting. A lot of rhododendrons in China grow on limestone. Oh. It's like a weird idea. And what they're really doing is they're a small patch of leaf litter and peat sitting on top of limestone. And when you take soil samples, the pH is remarkably high, actually. It's around about 6.5, 7. It's near neutral often. But when these plants are in growth, it's the monsoon season. So pretty much every day, fresh water is pouring out of the sky and running through and sort of, if you like, keeping the alkalinity of the saturated lime in the water. It keeps running down into the limestone. I think you're struggling to grow rhododendrons in a pH higher than 6, really. And it's particularly a problem because those areas tend to have saturated lime in the water, in their groundwater, and particularly in their tap water. So if you're going to irrigate your garden and you haven't got like tons of rainwater to do it with, you're probably going to be watering them and raising the pH doing that.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah.
There is a garden in Anglesey where Anglesey is mostly acidic, but there's a seam of limestone there, and there's a gardener who's gardening in quite high pH there, but he's doing something quite similar, which is essentially growing on a layer of peat and making sure that his groundwater is not rising up into the rhododendrons. Yeah. You can woodland garden on more acidic soil and more alkaline soil, but it's a different set of plants. And I didn't concentrate on that in this book, mainly because I have no experience of it. And the word count was already gigantic. I remember, John Grimshaw, when he was reviewing it, sort of said the only thing wrong with this book is it maybe should have dealt with what do you do if you've got alkaline soil? But I just thought horses for courses. When talking about the woodland gardening style, I think we are talking about generally.
Yeah.
Yes.
Or maybe that's the follow-on, Woodland Gardening 2, south of the border.
Yeah.
And
Another book. Yeah, sorry, Nell.
about question from Talaskari about some of the dwarf rhododendrons. How suitable are they for growing in containers?
They do pretty well in containers. The evergreen azalea is possibly better than the dwarf rhododendrons. It slightly depends where you live. Because they're alpine, they really dislike having hot roots in the summer. So if you grow dwarf rhododendrons in containers in the southeast of England, where you get regular temperatures in the mid-30s in the summer, those containers heat up, and you might well, because you're pouring water on them, they might well get root phytophoras. But if you're in a cooler climate, in places like Edinburgh, you get very successful town gardens with people growing dwarf rhododendrons in containers, and they do very well up there. So I think it depends a bit where you are. Rhododendrons in general do pretty well in containers. You've got to make sure the drainage is maintained. We recommend the sort of ericaceous compost that you buy in garden centres is pretty useless on its own in the long term because it doesn't have enough structure in it.
No.
We recommend putting grit, perlite, composted bark, things like that, because in order to make sure that the compost remains aerated, it doesn't become stagnant. If you do that, then sorry.
There's another question from Tracy Rich. She said, any recommendations for an informal rhodey hedge approximately 1 metre high? Now, I don't know whether she means a mix of rhodos or whether she means just a whatever, but I suppose if there are a few that you say would stay to about 1 metre in height for an informal hedge.
Yeah, rhododendrons don't stay to any height. They have of so many inches or centimetres a year, and they'll pretty much carry on doing that either outward or upward for as long as they live, really. But they're not hard to prune. The only thing about rhododendron pruning and hedges is that if you have to prune them as soon as they finish flowering, because they've got time to grow again and set flower buds. They set flower buds in July and August and September for the following year. So what people tend to do with hedges is they tidy them up in September. And if you do that, you'll be chopping all your flower buds off. So that's the only downside. Now, there are lots of dwarf rhododendrons that have a fairly columnar height. They go upwards more than outwards. Some of them are blue ones, things like Prey Cox and blue diamond and Penhill blue. These are dwarf rhododendrons. If you leave them unchecked, they'll grow to about 2 metres. And they're quite amenable to being pruned. And you can grow them semi-formally, and people do that quite successfully. So, but, yeah, I think
in Japan, I mean, there's a huge tradition of pruning rhododendrons or evergreen azaleas or whatever.
Yes, mainly called karikomi. It's the evergreen azaleas are more amenable to being shaped probably than dwarf rhododendrons are, but they don't really have the right shape. They tend to be more than upright, so they're not ideal for making hedges, but they are very amenable to pruning. Yeah.
Joe Burns, who's over in Cork, wants to know Rhodo Wiltonii. How long before one will flower?
Well, Cork is a very good climate for growing rhododendrons. My mother was from Cork, and I know it well. I do a lot of work over there. I've been doing work over there recently, actually. The thing about these rhododendron species is the happier they are, and the more rainfall you get, they just grow. And really, in order to make them flower, they really need a little bit of a shock in the summer, a bit of drought. You want your Wiltonii to flower. I would say probably around about 6 or 7 years old, it should start flowering. And it's pretty reliable. It flowers every year here, no problem at all. And if you want to, you basically need to give it a bit of a shock. And so if you don't water it in August until it wilts a little bit, that will make it flower. If you overdo it, you'll kill it. Don't overdo it. But basically, if you're impatient for it to flower, the other thing is the more sun it's in, the more likely it is to flower. If you've planted it in a very shady place, it'll just grow lots of lovely growth and won't bother to flower. The only reason anything flowers is because it fears for its life and wants to reproduce. And so if a plant is really happy, it can't be bothered to flower. It tends to be the case with rhododendrons. So I always say there's 3 stages. Stage 1, threaten it. Stage 2, cut the roots but don't move it. And stage 3 is to move it. If you move it, that's the biggest shock it can get. That'll make it flat.
Interesting. And also, what about the height and spread of Everred?
The original plant is probably about 6 feet by 6 feet, and it's from the mid 80s. It's, you know, it's in sort of 30 years old now. It's pretty slow growing.
I mean, at the end of the day, it's always with hybrids. You never quite know how big they're going to get, do you?
Well, it's not. It's really the same with everything. You think about 1970s dwarf conifers as
I'd rather not.
Discussed, right? So in Ben Moor in Argyll, they planted a collection of Adrian Bloom dwarf conifers in the 1970s. They're now 35 feet high. Well, I think they've cut a lot of them down. They're 35 feet high. Yes. And Adrian Bloom always said, I never said they were dwarf, I said they were slow growing. Same thing applies to rhododendrons. They grow, they have a growth rate. They grow and they grow until they get blown over or they die of old age, which is, they do about around 100 years old. Otherwise, they just keep growing. Yes. But most of them can be pruned. Really hard pruned. I spend a lot of time at the National Trust telling them to chainsaw their rhododendrons, and they're very panicky about it. And almost all, as long as the rhododendrons are healthy and the root systems are in good order, they will regenerate. There are a few,
yes, I was wondering. There
are a few exceptions with ones with peeling bark that don't regenerate. All the rest do. Rejuvenate an overgrown woodland garden with a chainsaw.
Yes.
On fire.
Yeah.
Frankly, I like to think I'm a great garden designer and I do all this exciting stuff. But most of what I do is telling people to cut things down with a chainsaw. That's pretty
regeneration. It's such an important part of so many natural cycles. So
yeah. No, absolutely.
Great. Well, that's been fantastic, Ken. It's been a great sort of finale. And we could have talked, I know there's a lot of other things we were going to talk about. Perhaps we can talk about them another time. But we've come to 5 o'clock now, so I think we should begin to be winding up.
Yeah, I mean, there's some lovely comments, Ken. Great story, so well told. Armchair travel and plants in one. Thanks, Ken. Noel and Annie, have a great weekend. And then Wendy Hilty, who's over in the States, is saying, I think she's in the States, do write a book on the jute industry in Dundee. It's a missing part of the 19th century Scottish history.
It is, yes.
Yeah.
It will be fascinating. Gosh, yes. So I think it remains for us to have a little sort of closing ceremony, Annie, and we'll be back.
Well, I tell you what I'm going to say. I'm going to find a dwarf conifer expert, and that's who's going to be the next.
really wind me up. Yes,
absolutely. And
price has just died.
You'll have to look jolly hard, I think.
No, you wait. Dixter, Fergus is using conifers, so watch out.
Jimmy started using them as well.
Yeah.
But I think thank you very much, Ken, for this. For I think probably our 40th contributor to this lockdown special, which we will be doing now at 6 o'clock every Thursday.
That's right.
A big thank you to all of our contributors who generously contributed their time. And thank you to, we actually have a big thank you to MEO, MEO. This is the Portuguese telecommunications company who, until recently, I used to curse rather than not. But they have been absolutely brilliant. We have had incredible broadband speeds here. I've been uploading and downloading gigabytes every day to make all this function. Whereas poor old Annie sometimes had to stay up till 2 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah,
watching things upload, and without MEO, I think this would have been very much more difficult. So thank you, MEO.
Muito obrigado, MEO.
Yes.
What's that?
Muito obrigado.
Ah, right. Yes, you're Portuguese, fluent in Portuguese, aren't you?
What we don't know about Ken is that he's also studied percussion in Brazil, and yes, a man of many parts.
Oh no! That was a fantastic talk, really fantastic talk, and how amazing to have that legacy of family and I mean, you know, and just to be traveling with people like Roy Lancaster, and oh, you must have so many tales to tell as well. It's just absolutely wonderful. I think there has to be a part 2 to this story. It's just great.
Yes,
I think you definitely need to do woodland gardening for soft southerners too. Come on.
dry woodland gardening.
Yeah, dry woodland gardening. That's the thing.
For soft Southerners. And also, I just want to remind everybody that, you know, please do an Instagram post, a little voice to camera thing, just to say what our series of Tea Time Talks has meant to you during lockdown. And there are prizes to be won, and they're pretty good prizes, I'm telling you now. It's a whole bag of dwarf conifers going to somebody.
I want to know who the world's greatest garden designer is.
Ah, well, if you get that right, then you can join that webinar. No, that's been wonderful. So thank you, Ken, and it's been great. It's sort of all these sort of thank yous coming in saying how enjoyable it's been. It's a bit sad, really, but we're not stopping. We're just reducing. We're just going to be doing it one day a week. But lots and lots of webinars. So please do sign up for the webinars, because there's some great people already enlisted, and also on our books to come. Lots of ideas. And anyone who hasn't sent in that survey that we sent out, I know surveys are tedious things, but you know, it's really important that we get
very useful information for us, actually. Very useful indeed.
Really useful, and especially subject matter, plants, speakers, gardens, parts of the world, you know, all of that kind of thing. The more we get, the more we can react to. So please keep those ideas coming. And if you can't be bothered to fill out a survey, then an email is the next best thing. So please do that.
And thank you, Annie, for being a fantastic partner on this.
That's all right. That's okay. Well, I couldn't compete with your shirt selection, but you know, I decided not to do that from day one. So there we go. Great. Okay. Well, before we start getting a bit tearful, we better sign off. Let's say, well, we've got plenty planned next week, and next Thursday, 6 o'clock UK time. Tune in. It'll be another great talk.